Hello, this is Preheat. Welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So today we're going to be talking about Augmentation Evoker. So I was fortunate enough to get an interview with a senior game designer at Blizzard. And I have a whole list of questions that I and the other Evoker experts in the Wormrest Temple, that's the Evoker Discord, we've prepared this whole list of questions for them. And I also have some questions that I reached out to the community for that I'll be asking at the end. As always, if you like my content, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and hopefully I see you in the next one. Today, I'm joined by Berger, Senior Game Designer 2, Director Evoker. So we've already chatted before, but for everyone else, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey there, yeah. As Preheat said, I'm Berger. I'm a member of the combat design team, so worked on Dractyr Evoker at launch and bringing Augmentation Evoker to WoW.
Awesome. And for a little background on me, my name is Preheat. I've rated at World First level for years. I've been MDI participant in the past. I've participated in the Race to World First. Now I'm a WoWhead guide writer and content creator. So, now that the expansion's been out for about 6 months, we've had a couple tiers to get a sense for how Evoker feels. Definitely enjoying Evoker a lot, especially Devastation. And it's very exciting to have a third spec coming in to mix things up. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Augmentation Evoker is a new damage dealer coming to Evoker in 10.1.5. It's reminiscent of other typical support classes in RPGs, kind of like Bard, I guess. Maybe you can't say that, but I think it's kind of like that. And they deal damage themselves, but act as kind of a force multiplier. They kind of multiply the damage in the group, increasing the damage output significantly. So I've had a lot of fun with Augmentation on the PTR. It's actually playable right now, especially doing my 15 Augmentation stack. We went in with 15 Augmentation Evokers into the raid. It was a bit mixed. I wouldn't say it was a complete
enjoyed
success.
that. Thank you for testing.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, I love testing that stuff. But I do have some questions for you if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so first off, adding a support role to this game after 18 years seems like kind of a bold move. So what was the thought process behind adding a support role that Augmentation fits into?
So there are kind of two big factors. One, more just on adding more to Evoker. At launch, we introduced the Dractyr to the world and got to tell a lot of their story, but had more to tell. And so the idea of continuing their story in patches, getting to, continue seeing Emberthal's character growth and kind of where her journey is taking her, had this idea of what more can we do with Evoker? What more can we do with Dractyr? And a big part of that was we haven't explored kind of black Dragonflight magic all that thoroughly, right? We've got Deep Breath and Obsidian Scales and Landslide, but that's it. And I think a lot of players kind of pointed out, like, where are all the black spells? What, that's all they have. That's kind of weird. So had some ideas very early on if we want to do something with that. But then for Augmentation, being the support role or support playstyle rather, came out of a couple different places. One being Evokers are this mid-ranged caster and wanting to lean into that and what else can they do with their magic and just explore that more thoroughly. And then thematically, the Dractyr are, they work in teams, they work in their Warrens and their different factions, and that thematic sense for Evoker as a class has been really important to us from the beginning. So it was kind of all these factors coming together and us saying, well, we have an opportunity here to do something really different, something the team has been talking about for a long, long time, but never has kind of found the right home for. Let's explore it. And by doing it in a content patch down the road rather than at launch, that was giving ourselves time to answer a lot of the questions that this new playstyle raises, right? How do you balance this? How does it work in different group sizes? All that stuff. So wanted to make sure we had the time to kind of create answers to all of those and be confident in the direction.
So to follow up on that, so the role of Augmentation, right, like the slot it fills in the raid, the fact that it's a damage dealer, I feel like is the most interesting part of it, right? Because we've had obviously support stuff happening before. There's like power infusion, there's like healers who are like support, I guess you could say, and tanking, right? But like it's a damage dealer. So why implement Augmentation as a damage dealer instead of a healer or a tank?
Because we wanted to make sure that we could really fulfill kind of the promise of buffing your allies and increasing their damage. I think making it a tank or a healer runs the risk of sort of diluting what it's promising. That idea of, you're going to bring buffs. Well, if it's the one healer who can increase the damage of everyone else really significantly, then that's not really even with all the other healers,
you just
right?
run that healer.
Yeah, and the tuning of the game and what you're bringing to a raid is a super important consideration. And knowing that we didn't want to add a fourth role to the game, we don't want to change the dynamic of a tank or of a dungeon rather being one tank, one healer, three DPS to
Hmm.
be I don't know that plus a support role or that sort of thing. So keeping it in that damage dealer lane let us really go wild with the tuning and let you provide really large impactful buffs to your allies instead of just like nodding to it, right? I think that's what we've had in the past. We've had Enhancement Shaman, Totem Twisting, and Shadow Priest Mana Return, and those were awesome back in BC and Lich King. But for the modern game, they don't fit super well anymore. I think a lot of players kind of their expectations for if you're an enhancement shaman, you're doing full damage alongside everyone else, right? And Wind Fury is sort of this like little side extra.
Right.
Um, but for this playstyle and kind of the audience of players who want to play this type of character, we wanted to be able to give you that really fulfilling, like, no, you are buffing the heck out of people, and it's going to make a big difference. So making him damage dealer fit the best with that.
Yeah, I'll be honest, like I was really excited for potentially a tank just so I could do dungeons as a tank, but it
I
definitely
get
makes
that.
sense that like having the damage impact be that big would just make that the tank you would run for everything,
Right.
right? Like you just wouldn't run
Exactly.
any other tank.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so some see this as kind of like a paradigm shift for World of Warcraft. Others see it as more of an experiment. If this goes well, is there any chance that more support specializations are on the way?
So I think really, add anytime we want to add a spec or a class to the game, it is a combination of a couple things. Is this the right time for the game? Thematically, does this make sense? Right? We did Evoker not because we wanted to make a dragon character, but because we were going to the Dragon Isles in Dragonflight. Okay, this fits really well. This is super cool for this moment in World of Warcraft. So I think we would need that piece of it. But then, yeah, certainly like I'm really interested in seeing the community's reaction to augmentation when it goes live, and if there are calls for more of this play style and really seeing it taking off, I think that's something we discuss very seriously for sure.
Okay, so if it has good reception, maybe there's a chance. That's pretty cool. The announcement for Augmentation Evoker mentions that work is being quote unquote done on new combat log hooks so that add-ons and community websites can effectively measure your performance. So as a high-end player, being able to accurately judge my performance and the performance of others is kind of like a big part of I guess my success and what I have to do in a raid. And these hooks are necessary to do so, especially like seeing it live in game. So will these be available for testing on the PTR soon?
Yes, so definitely agree. Like, especially from our perspective, giving players the tools to understand how to improve as augmentation, right? That's a big concern for us. We have kind of the upfront thing of the Ebon Might bar on the UI on your player portrait and personal resource display to say, okay, like if this bar isn't staying pretty full most of the time, that's what you should focus on first. But yeah, when you want to take that next step and really start min-maxing and understanding the nuances of your rotation, you need those additional tools to kind of do that. It is a big project to provide all those combat hooks. The math of WoW is extremely complicated,
Right.
but it is in progress. So as of this recording, um, things that are already working on the PTR builds that are in the advanced combat log are any flat damage events. So things like Inferno's Blessing or Breath of Eons, that's being able to be attributed already. And then we're getting in a first version of Prescience and Shifting Sands. So the critical strike and versatility buffs, we'll start attributing those. The next big piece is Ebon Might, and I think that's going to come out in stages as well because it is such kind of a massive undertaking to make that attribute correctly all over the place, but something we're going to keep working on up through ship and beyond. But yeah, we should be able to start kind of seeing the results of that this week.
This week, okay. But is there a chance that it releases without having these hooks? I guess.
So anything that's on PTR in terms of the combat logging will be what comes out in Fractures in Time for
Okay.
sure. I can imagine, if there are some very special case abilities that just the way they're built is super weird, maybe we aren't attributing those 100% properly just yet, but it's something we're going to keep working on.
Okay. I asked just because, like, I know from my perspective, if I was asked, like, is augmentation evoker good, I would have an answer for that, right? Because I would
Sure.
know the theory crafting
Yeah.
behind it. But a lot
Yeah.
of players will just look at the damage log and be like, damage is bad, this class sucks, right?
Yeah.
And, like, they'll probably be wrong about it, but, I feel like it's an important aspect. So,
No, yeah, and where it shows on the damage meters, I think a big part of, when we did the blog post originally announcing it, interviewing with creators such as yourselves, a big part of that is to help sort of inform the greater player base that like this is very new for WoW and it's
Hmm.
not going to show up the way you might anticipate, but it is still doing a lot for you.
Okay, we'll let you have some time to figure that one out, but that's good enough for now. So augmentation is being classified as a DPS, but is dealing significantly less damage unless you have the ability to DPS buff other people, right? So are there guardrails in place? I found this out whenever I did the 15 evoker thing, right? Like if you're buffing a bunch of augmentation evokers, nothing really happens because a lot of your damage isn't from augmentation, right? You need to be buffing damage dealers who do normal damage. So
Mhm.
are there guardrails in place to prevent multiple augmentation evokers from queuing into the same 5-man group? And in the follow-up to that, will augmentation be classified as a DPS for solo shuffle?
So there are not additional rules on dungeon queuing or PvP queuing for augmentation. The current balance of kind of how much damage they're dealing versus how much they're buffing, that's something we're still iterating on. And
Okay.
so, if they're dealing less than we're kind of intending, that's something we'd want to bring up and shift some of their power from buffs to their individual power. But kind of the balance of that and the stacking effects of what they do. The plan is that for queuing a heroic dungeon or joining a mythic zero, like having two augmentation evokers in that dungeon, you should still be totally successful running that dungeon. I think if you're trying to do a mythic 20, then having multiple probably isn't going to be as successful.
Right.
But that's the case of you probably shouldn't bring like 3 subtlety rogues to a mythic plus either,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah,
And
it's the
and
same
if
thing.
that's where the game ends up, like that's something we'd want to address regardless of the class.
Right. Okay. So I think of being like a healer, and they always complain about like queuing in solo shuffle and getting paired with people
Mm-hmm.
who like just don't do any damage. I just imagine like if you're a healer, you just go god mode with augmentation. But
Potentially that spatial paradox and wear and stun are pretty powerful. We do have the PvP mult system though, and so I
okay.
think augmentation's kind of share of damage to buffing is going to be shifted fairly significantly in PvP from what we see in
Oh.
PvE because the gameplay is just so different that the kind of PvE target doesn't really match kind of the realities of how PvP is played. So we have the tools to adjust that as well.
Oh, cool. So it'll just do different damage in there. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
it'll
Okay.
still you'll still be buffing. That'll still be an important part of how you play, but I would expect you to do more damage in PvP than you do in PvE.
Wow. Okay. So augmentation brings some powerful defensive options in Mythic Plus, right? Like you're coming in as a DPS, but you've stuff like Chrono Ward, your Draconic Attunements, right? Where basically you press a button and it gives like a 20% health rally during your Obsidian Scales. So if augmentation indirectly contributes a comparable amount of DPS to other specs, right? If you get the bottom line of all the buffs and
Mhm.
everything, won't that just make it kind of irreplaceable in the group setting? Like, how do you plan to balance a spec with so much powerful defensive options as a DPS?
So a couple factors there. Certainly, if the defense they're providing is too great, that's something we'll need to take a look at, right? I think Aspect's favor is pretty strong at the moment, when we'll be talking about that. But part of augmentation kind of top-down goals was making it really approachable, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is this new play style. I think one of the player types we're hoping will play augmentation is like you haven't played damage dealer before, or maybe you have too many healers tonight for raid and someone needs to go DPS. Okay, augmentation is like a great fit for that because it is still helping the raid. You're still getting that same sort of emotional experience. Part of making it approachable is to make it more survivable. That's why you see things like Defy Fate in the
Yeah,
augmentation
the
tree
cheat
rather
deaths.
than the class tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
And part of that too is, if augmentation is the last one alive in a group, they can't bring it home, right? They don't
Right.
have the personal damage to do it. So them staying alive isn't as great a benefit as, say, Devastation staying alive to the end.
Huh.
Um,
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, that's an
no.
interesting perspective.
But yeah, that the group utility, the group defensives, uh, it's also that play style as we see it, taking inspiration from other games and kind of what is appealing about that sort of support role to folks is what weird tools do I bring to the group, right? What makes people excited to have me, even though my damage is lower, but I'm going to do something so cool that they're like, I'm glad that person showed up. That's rad.
Yeah.
So that was a big part of it is trying all these new tools and giving them weird things they can do for the group. So I think the defensive specifically are something that we'll need to keep a really close eye on for tuning, but overall pretty happy with where the package is at.
Yeah, I imagine too if groups are just running no healer with augmentation, you'd probably do something about that.
Yeah, that is, yeah, definitely not the intention. So,
Okay.
and that's why things like, Dream of Spring and kind of the Emerald Blossom package is so far deep down and edges into that bottom portion of the tree is because, yeah, you should have to give up some damage to take those tools if that's
Mm,
something you want to do, right? Not replace the healer.
yeah. Okay. Yeah, so when one spec is needed, other specs for that same class, usually if there's like multiple DPS specs, there's kind of like a push and pull, I guess.
Yeah.
It's especially true when a class like has more than one DPS spec, like we're saying, like Rogue, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Basically, everyone just plays whichever one is the best. So if augmentation feels like really strong, maybe even necessary, then a lot of players out there who are currently enjoying Devastation might end up just getting like shoehorned into augmentation. I've already gotten pressure from my guild. Like, hey, you go into augmentation. So how do you plan to keep Devastation on the menu, right? How do you keep it on equal footing?
I mean, maybe a bit of a cop-out answer, but like balance is just such a big part of that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
augmentation, we have the tools to manage that between just numerically the value of the buffs they're providing, but also we have, we built in things like closest clutch mates that passive where when you're not in a raid, your abilities are more powerful. So we can tune you for a dungeon somewhat separately from how you're tuned for a raid. But no, like you said, that's something we see for any of our, especially our pure DPS classes, mage and rogue. And so it's just something Evoker, we're going to have to keep an eye on and make sure that both remain viable. I think they're going to have different strengths and weaknesses and different sorts of raid encounters and that sort of thing. And yeah, because they do feel so different. The goal is not to have every Devastation Evoker switch over.
Right.
So
I,
I think it's something we'll have to just be vigilant about and keep working on.
yeah, I think also like you need to be buffing good damage dealers as augmentation. Like
Absolutely.
that's really important. So if you're pumping on Devastation, topping the meters, maybe your group should get someone else to go augmentation.
I say if you're the best one to get buffed, then
just saying. Yeah, it's actually true. No, numerically it is true. Devastation is right now it's the top dog, at least as far as we know in theory crafting. So yeah, that's a little check on the Devastation there. So I have some questions that are a little bit more in the weeds. These are like rotational questions. So augmentation is all about being a force multiplier, but it's still a damage dealer, right? So right now it's the ratio. It's like around 20% of your damage is personal versus around 80% of its buffs. So that's a pretty big share. So this means that the overwhelming majority of your success as augmentation is about your allies. So does Blizzard have a goal in mind for what sort of portion of personal damage should be there versus the buffs that augmentation provides?
Yeah, I think philosophically, that is kind of what we're targeting, not those specific numbers, but having the majority of your benefit be based on your allies' performance and maintaining your buffs on them, because that's what the role is all about. It's this promise of like, you are making others better. And I think there's a bit of like, if you give someone 3% of this thing, and that's your, support, it's like, yeah, support in name, but we want it to be support in reality, right? How much damage they're dealing personally, 20% sounds lower than kind of what we'd like, in large part for the outdoor kind of solo experience. Like you need to be able to go and do quests and do world events and be successful,
Right.
even if you don't have a group around you. And a lot of their defensives are kind of playing into that. Put blistering scales on yourself. You have, ways to heal. You have the Nourishing Sands passive, but you still need to be able to kill stuff too. So I think that's something we're definitely keeping an eye on. Want to make sure that you can be successful outdoor, but when you join a group, your main value is in buffing others.
I will say, like, if you're outdoors and there's other people around, I love the fact that whenever you press your abilities, you just automatically buff people around you. Like, I don't have to look at them. I don't have to think about them. If I'm just doing questing, I just see, popping up verse buffs, int buffs. Everyone's getting buffed around me. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so because so much of your damage is in the hands of your allies, right? The buffs that you get, it's basically coming from pressing your cooldowns. You can essentially choose to just, like, not press any spenders whatsoever. So not build, not spend, no living flame, no eruption, and you'll still do, right now the estimate's thinking around 80% of the damage, like 80% of the overall impact. So you don't have to be very active, I guess, because of that. You can kind of just get the benefit of the buffs without really having to play much here. So how do you address, or are there plans to address how passive the spec is currently?
Preheat, is 80% good enough for you?
No, it's not. Not for me. But like,
no, what's the heart of the question? I'm just saying,
no, I
you're
mean, you
not
have
going
a
to play
point.
80%.
You raise a good point. Yeah, I care about every single percentage. So I mean, like, if I'm 2% behind, then that's no good. I gotta
Yeah.
be, yeah. It's a good
Um,
point for like a hardcore player, but I think for a lot of more casual players, they probably think like, oh well, cool, I can just eat Cheetos while I play and
yeah.
watch anime.
And so honestly, that's very intentional. Part of
Okay.
making it approachable is I always mix up the terminology. We want the skill floor for augmentation to be fairly high. That if you show up and play augmentation, as long as your friends that you're buffing are playing well, you will contribute significantly to the group, and
Okay.
kind of having that smaller gap between the bottom and the top. Not that we're trying to remove, the depth and mastery of the spec. And I think things like target, picking who you target with prescience and timing all your utility and using that, there's still a lot, you can do as an augmentation evoker to play really well and eke out those percentage points. But yeah, showing up and kind of focusing on Ebon Might uptime and therefore contributing significantly to a group was very much a goal for the spec, to make it something that people who, like I was saying, don't play damage or don't play it often, or maybe, are put off by evokers, shorter range and mobility and empower spells, can now have something they can try with augmentation, and if they, weren't interested in devastation or preservation.
Cool. Yeah, I also like that you can kind of just do jobs, right? Because you're just running around doing the mechanics, just kind of tidying up and giving the buffs and all that fun stuff while everyone else does damage. Cool. Okay. All right. So when I play augmentation on the PTR, I'm very excited by the potential utility I'm bringing to the group, right? Like I feel like I'm doing a lot for my group. But aside from pressing my cooldowns, this kind of ties into the last question, but aside from really pressing just my cooldowns and stuff, I feel like most of my damage is just happening almost kind of automatically. Like the rotation itself doesn't really excite me as much as like the potential benefits I'm bringing. So are you, and I say you as like the team, are you satisfied with the current gameplay of augmentation, and are there any changes planned to make it feel maybe more engaging?
So it goes back to the same topic of approachability, but having a more straightforward rotation than, say, devastation or preservation was, again, very intentional to kind of give space for the buffs to breathe,
Okay.
and let players say, okay, you have your damage rotation, you need to do that, but you have this second kind of plate you're spinning and cycle of things you're thinking about of, okay, what's the timing on my buffs? And especially as you get more into it, who do I want to target with these things? I think with augmentation, when we were starting to build it and iterating on it and coming up with just like, what spell should it have? What the heck does it spec do? We tried a lot of versions that were much more kind of best friend themed, of like, you pick one buddy and you're going to buff the heck out of them. And tuning wise, it was like totally fine. We could do that. But as you can imagine, everyone else in the group felt left out, which wasn't great.
Right.
But for the augmentation evoker, it created this real burden of knowledge, which, for yourself is probably no problem. You know what everyone else in your raid can do. But for a more casual player or more a lower information player, it's like, who's the right person to buff? I don't know. And so making all the buffs affect everyone in your party and have all those auto targeting capabilities, really brought that burden of knowledge down, unless you want to opt into it. The more straightforward rotation is another piece of that, of, okay, you can just focus on kind of maintain Ebon Might, hit your buffs on cooldown, and like, as long as you're doing those things, you're going to do pretty well. And then all that extra utility is sort of where we see the depth of the class, and
Okay.
choosing who you want to buff, and lining up your Breath of Eons with the mage combusting or the devastation evoker dragon raging.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a new way to kind of think about min-maxing, right? Because it's not so much, well, I guess it kind of is in line with the support class, where you're more min-maxing around using the abilities
Others,
with your
right?
allies. Yeah, exactly. Paying attention to them. Okay. So these questions are all about Ebon Might, these next ones. So a lot of the buffs augmentation provides have some form of like intelligent targeting. We were talking about that before, where you can choose who they go on, and it is automatic still if you don't. So this means that you don't necessarily need macros to play augmentation, which I think is fantastic. Ebon Might is one of the strongest abilities that augmentation has, and it seems to be mostly just proximity base. So what was what's the goal of closest targets versus party buffs?
So two kind of primary goals. One was from a raid leader perspective. the idea of having to kind of manage every group in your raid to adjust for your augmentation evokers was didn't sound like a ton of fun to a lot of us working on it. We're like, there's probably someone out there who would enjoy that, but for the average player, like that's not going to be a great experience, especially once it's okay, who's in the Wind Fury group? Should there be an augmentation evoker in the Wind Fury group? Do you need to trade out the arms for it?
Yeah.
A lot of questions versus just have it work, pick nearest, and kind of we tried a couple different methods for targeting and have tweaked sort of the algorithm it uses to target, but to avoid those sort of questions for organized groups. And then nearest, and it does, prefers damage dealers. If you overlap it with an existing one, it will rebuff the same people you already have your Ebon Might on. Is adding some of that depth and mastery of, okay, I know who's best in my raid. Let me move near them to make sure they get the buff. A tool we added a little later on in the process that I think the community is close to figuring out, but maybe haven't hit on yet, is that your Ebon Might will actually prefer targets with your prescience. So you can
Oh,
use prescience to softly prioritize up to, however many two
right.
DPS targets in your raid if you want to.
Well, that's half of them, so that's pretty
Yeah.
good.
So
Yeah.
hopefully that helps, especially kind of reduce that need for very strict positioning as well.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that was kind of the biggest thing we noticed whenever we were doing augmentation in that stack, and I know it's probably changed a lot since then. But like, sometimes you'd be in the situation where two augmentation evokers would be too close, and then they start
Mhm.
buffing each other, and it's like it kind of wastes the buff, right? So, is this kind of like a design decision to like kind of deter having too many augmentation evokers in the raid?
That's a piece of it, yeah, that, the ideal raid to us, and I think to players, is not one tank, four healers, and one mage and 15 augmentation evokers. That doesn't sound super fun. So there is that sort of soft cap of if you don't want augs to buff each other, if that
Right.
isn't sort of the best use of their Ebon Might, then don't bring too many of them. Obviously, it still does benefit their damage and benefits some of the buffs they give out, but it is a little bit lower than other targets it could potentially go on.
Yeah, if you had 15, that group would be very scaled.
Yeah. Oh,
Sorry, had to.
no, that's great.
So I mean, like, what is the number then, right? Like, do you have a number in mind for how many would be optimal in a raid?
I don't think there's raid sizes. Mythic is 20, right? But
Right.
we're always looking at flex and battlegrounds and such. So there isn't an optimal size. I mean, one per four DPS is functional. I don't think that's going to be necessary for a
Okay.
raid to be successful. That has been a goal for augmentation as well. Is like we don't want this to be a necessary specialization. It is intended to be a choice, right? We have 38 flavors of how to play WoW. This is the 39th. So, and if that's the case because of tuning, that's something we have the tools to adjust and would definitely look at. So I think at most probably you only want one for every four other DPS if you're trying to really min max, but certainly not something we expect you to have in terms of tuning.
Okay, cool. So augmentation might not be officially out yet, but we've already been hard at work. A lot of folks have been theory crafting it, and it looks like right now mastery is by far the most important stat, to the point where you essentially ignore everything unless it has mastery. So on the flip side of that, we also have versatility, which, we mentioned before, augmentation, like 20% of the damage is coming from the evoker themselves, like directly. So versatility is basically just damage reduction as a stat. So are there any plans to maybe look at how the stats work again and try to get, crit and haste and especially versatility raised up to the level where mastery isn't just like 4 times better than they are?
Definitely something we're looking at. It's, nerfed it once, probably nerf it again. But we want itemization to be, and gearing choices to be as impactful to augmentation as to other classes. I think with the nature of this sort of play style and the fact that, yeah, when you buff others with your primary stat, that primary is affected by their secondary stats,
Right.
right? And so we have this math problem of if you have a low eye level augmentation evoker and a low eye level buff target, and then two that are both high eye level, it's pretty easy to get down this road of double dipping where
Right.
both of their secondary stats are multiplying on each other. So that's something we worked through early on of like, okay, what are the kind of rules we need to put in place to prevent that sort of thing to make sure that they'll scale appropriately over the course of the expansion. And mastery has been an interesting journey as well. If we came up with what we think is a really cool idea for how it works, but oh yeah, it turns out that's really strong. So going to keep evaluating it, and those combat log tools we were talking about earlier, having those come online, that helps us too, right? Get a more and more accurate look at how things are playing out and get more and more data from playtesting and that sort of thing. So definitely something we're going to keep looking at. As we adjust their damage up, that'll raise the value of those secondaries like versatility for them. Mastery, probably has to come down a little bit more.
Yeah, I think also it's important to note though that even though crit and haste, they do interact like with the buffs. You can look at like crit, how it gives more uptime. It's still just like if you were to compare it against like a normal DPS, gaining stats in the crit and haste is just way worse than like a normal secondary. Even if crit's like bad for Fire Mage, for instance, it's like considerably worse than it would be. So, yeah. So I guess a lot of those, I'm just trying to say, I think it's more than just mastery being lowered. I think also got to pick those things up.
There's a bunch of goals, right? Is get them all in line, make sure that they're valuable for augmentation, make sure that they're not better than intellect, those sorts of things.
Okay, cool. So these are community questions. Those are the hard ones, by the way. Yeah. So we have a lot of talents in the tree. This one is one that Devastation Enjoyer, I'm sure, wrote. So they asked, Augmentation has some really awesome talents like Stretch Time, which spaces out the damage you take in Deep Breath, the 5 Fate, which is a cheat death, Timelessness, which reduces threat. A lot of these seem like a perfect fit for Devastation. Is there any chance some of these end up making it on the class tree instead?
So no plans at the moment. Like I was saying, we want Augmentation to be particularly survivable because of the role they're filling and kind of their niche. But definitely Devastation survivability is something we're talking about a lot. And actually, I think we're a few hours too early at the time of recording this, but there are some changes to the class tree coming. We're making Draconic Legacy a 1-point node instead of 2. So it's still 6% stamina, but you only have to spend 1 point on it. And there's we've moved Regenerative Mana, and it is now 3% Leech. And it's underneath Instinctive Arcana, so in that line down to Blast Furnace. And a few others, but we want to address survivability kind of in that way, in things that fit the whole class and make sense for both Devastation and Preservation, as well as Aug, and kind of leave Aug's fun toys for them for now.
Okay. Yeah. I just, so whenever I read this, it kind of made me think back when I was a kid, and like if I'd been asking all year for a bicycle, and then Christmas rolls around, and then my little brother gets a bicycle and I get nothing. I'm just like, what the heck? That's what I was asking for. That was supposed to be for me. But I'll wait and see how the new survivability stuff for Devastation. That's really exciting to know. So on to the next one. So this one, this one's actually interesting. So there is a lot of stigma over things like parses, contributions, in, I guess you could say, like the WoW community. So was the addition of Augmentation in part a reaction to the parse culture, you could say? And how do you expect Augmentation to combat and challenge player perceptions and presumptions?
That's a great question. So really, Augmentation was coming from something, it was the team being excited about this play style and this fantasy and these mechanics, and wanting to introduce that to the game, right? And I think we talked about game 1 versus game 2. I'm sure you've heard that discussion before. That is something we are always kind of keeping in mind and considering. But at the end of the day, there is an audience for this play style, and they are going to love the heck out of whatever we make for this. And we want to make sure that we can deliver something awesome to them without, totally changing how the game works for everyone else or making a completely different World of Warcraft. And Augmentation is sort of targeting that of, let's make something really cool that hasn't been seen before, but still fits in the expectations of the game. And yeah, I think it'll be interesting to kind of see how the community reacts to Augmentation in logs and their attributions, and the information they can glean from that. So no specific kind of desires for outcome there, but more, we think this is an awesome addition to the game. We want to make sure the community has the tools to evaluate it and continue, trying to improve themselves and those sorts of things. But just looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of interesting conversations happening from it. Okay, last question. When is Fractures in Time going live?
So no date to announce today, but we're working super hard on it and can't wait to get it into your hands.
Dang it, I tried. Okay. Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you again, Graham. I appreciate it.
Likewise, this is a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's it for today. So, all right. So I know we're at time. I guess we just